On January 27, 1967, a fire started in the cockpit of the Apollo 1 prototype and killed the three astronauts inside, Roger Chaffee, Edward White, and Gus Grissom. Because of this, NASA made a huge commitment to making their spaceships safer. Without the tragedy of Apollo 1, landing on the moon would have not been possible. The most hardworking, deserving, and fearless heroes seem to be the most forgotten. The three men that died on the Apollo 1 pre-flight test sadly fall under this category. In the 1960s, the United States and NASA got stuck under this trance of trying to beat the Soviet Union in the space race, so they didn't stop and think thoroughly about the safety of their astronauts. What started this all was when the Soviet Union, or USSR, launched the Sputnik 1 on October 4, 1957. The US president at the time, Dwight Eisenhower, responded by creating the National Space Administration, or NASA, to push the United States' advancement in space technology. This started the space race between the Soviet Union and the United States. The USSR got the first man into space on April 12, 1961, with Yuri Gagarin. The US were furious that the Soviet Union were advancing into space faster than them, so the President John F. Kennedy took into action and announced the inauguration of the Apollo program that would take the first man to the moon. The three astronauts that would be going on the first Apollo mission were Commander Gus Grissom, Senior Pilot Edward White, and Crew Pilot Roger Chaffee. Roger Bruce Chaffee was born on February 15, 1935. Chaffee was introduced to flight at a very young age because of his father's profound interest in aircrafts. Chaffee loved making model airplanes and joined Boy Scouts, which gave him survival skills that was useful later in his career as astronaut. In high school, Chaffee became an Eagle Scout and was a stellar student that had an interest for electronics and engineering. He eventually went to Purdue University and met his wife Martha on a blind date. In 1957, Chaffee graduated with a bachelor's degree in aeronautical engineering. With experience in the Air Force, Chaffee started aircraft training and had a son named Stephen and a daughter named Cheryl Lynn. Chaffee got his wings early in 1961 and started to take graduate-level courses in engineering. While he was doing his studies, he entered in a pool of 1,800 applicants who sought out to be one of NASA's astronaut corps. On October 14, 1963, Chaffee was selected as one of NASA's newest astronauts. After 2.5 years of astronaut training, Chaffee was chosen to be crew pilot on the first Apollo flight. Virgil Ivan Grissom, or commonly known as Gus, was born on April 3, 1926, in the small port town of Mitchell, Indiana. Grissom wasn't a great student in high school, but his wife Betty helped him get his bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering in 1950. Gus had two sons named Scotty and Mark that he liked to go fishing and hunting with. After Grissom became a test pilot, he got introduced to NASA's Mercury program and enlisted as one of NASA's newest astronauts. Gus's first space mission was on the Liberty Bell 7, which sank into the Atlantic Ocean while landing back on Earth. After the Liberty Bell incident, Grissom got involved in the Gemini project and was selected to be commander of the Gemini 3. After Gemini 3's magnificent performance, Grissom was greeted by a parade and a service medal from the president. Gemini 3 made him the first man to fly into space twice. Hard work, drive, persistence, and skills as a high-class pilot granted him the position of being the commander of the first Apollo flight. Edward Higgins White II was born on November 14, 1930 in San Antonio, Texas. Like Chaffee, White was born into flying because of his dad being in the Air Force. White was an excellent athlete and student in high school and college, in which he almost got into the Olympics for track and graduated with a bachelor's degree of science. After college, he joined the Air Force like his dad. Once White read an article about future astronauts, he got his MS degree in aeronautical engineering in 1959, along with flying NASA's Project Mercury astronauts during their training exercises. After Project Mercury closed, Project Gemini opened, so White enlisted and got accepted. White got selected to be Gemini 4 pilot along with Jim McDivitt. That flight made him the first American to spacewalk. Because of White's amazing EVA, or spacewalk, performance, he was selected to be senior pilot for the first Apollo flight.
Apollo astronauts Roger Chaffee, Edward White, and Gus Grissom lose their lives in a tragic flash fire aboard their grounded space capsule.
All the astronauts are trained and ready to start the non-hazardous pre-flight test that will kick off the first Apollo spacecraft and which will engrave America's path to the moon. That's what everyone thought. NASA was pushing deadlines and rushing through safety checks. Even before the pre-flight test, there were major issues that the system personnel and NASA just pushed aside. The first problem occurred when Apollo 1 astronaut Gus Grissom entered the spacecraft and hooked up his oxygen supply. He described a sour smell in the spacesuit loop, but NASA still continued the test. Soon after this, there was a high oxygen flow warning, which periodically triggered the master alarm. The environmental control system personnel convinced the astronauts it was just the high flow coming from the movement of the crew. The third major issue was the difficulty to communicate between pilot Grissom and the control room. Grissom even said at one point during the test,
Now we gotta get the moon. We can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings.
The countdown at 5:40 p.m. was held back because of the lack of communication. Finally, at 6:31 p.m., the test conductors were ready. Suddenly, there was an unexpected rise in the oxygen flow into the spacesuits. Silence fell over the intercom until White yells,
Hey! Oh, got fire in the cockpit!
Before the pre-flight test, the crew never completed the emergency routines in the minimum amount of time. The routine included Grissom lowering White's headrest so White could reach above and behind his left shoulder to activate the ratchet-type device that would release the first series of latches. While White was trying to turn the ratchet, he was buried in smoke. Spacecraft technicians ran towards the spacecraft, but before they could reach it, the command modules blasted into flames. Thick black clouds of smoke fired out, filling the room. Many feared that the fire might set off the launch escape system that could possibly ignite the entire service structure. Once the technicians finally opened the capsule, it was too late. They were all dead. Firemen and doctors arrived a few minutes after the capsule was opened and determined that the astronauts died because of the carbon monoxide poisoning and a great deal of thermal burns. Of the men that tried to get the astronauts out, there were 27 treated for smoke in their lungs and 2 were hospitalized. After they removed the bodies, NASA set up a review board to investigate the damaged craft thoroughly. The Apollo 1 craft was later shipped to the NASA Kennedy Space Center to help the board investigate the cause of the fire. They carefully disassembled the craft while taking photographs of each exposed area as they were being removed. While that was happening, the Manned Spacecraft Center duplicated conditions of the Apollo 1 fire without the crewmen inside to see what really happened. The tests showed that the fire started on the left side of the cabin by Grissom's feet. After doing these tests and disassembly, some of the things that caused the fire listed by NASA's History Office include a sealed cabin pressurized with the oxygen atmosphere, an extensive distribution of combustible materials in the cabin, vulnerable wiring carrying spacecraft power, vulnerable plumbing carrying a combustible and corrosive coolant, inadequate provisions for the crew to escape, and inadequate provisions for rescue or medical assistance. NASA took in every suggestion made by the investigation committee to ensure the safety of their astronauts in the future. This led to major changes that made travel in space 10 times safer. One of the changes was the gas and pressure and amounts used in the spacecrafts. Since the air was filled with pure oxygen gas, it was perfect for the fire and consumed it instantly. Also, the pressure inside the capsule was higher than the pressure outside the capsule, and the hatch opened inward. It was almost impossible for the astronauts to get it open, so for the rest of the Apollo missions, the atmosphere inside the launch was made of 60% oxygen and 40% nitrogen, while the astronauts had pure oxygen inside of their suits. Speaking of suits, NASA made their astronaut suits and command modules out of non-flammable material. NASA also reconstructed their safety procedures and approach towards spaceflight as a whole. The deaths of Roger Chaffee, Edward White, and Gus Grissom in the Apollo 1 plug-out test had vital impacts on America's history. After the Apollo 1 disaster, NASA made changes that would last throughout the entire Apollo missions. For some reason the disaster didn't happen, it would have affected all of the Apollo missions, including Apollo 11, which was the mission that got the first man on the moon. If having a major influence on whether the United States would get to the moon or not isn't a great impact on America's history, then I don't know what is. Also, if the Apollo 1 mission got delayed, the Soviets could have jumped in and got to the moon first. During that time, it would suggest that only 40 years after the 1917 revolution, the USSR would have proved that the communism way was the best system for intellectual and economic development, which the US does not want. Overall, the tragedy that was Apollo 1 was a gigantic wake-up call for NASA. They realized that as an organization, they were so focused on being the Soviets in the space race that they become somewhat apathetic about safety. I'm grateful that NASA realized that these major safety hazards were a problem and took into action, but the fact that they only realized this after 3 fearless men died as a source of NASA's apathy towards safety makes me disappointed. This also makes me feel that we should honor and remember these men, as well as any other American disaster, like 9/11, Apollo 13, and the Challenger. Besides the major downfalls of how the American space program got to be, I know that the Apollo 1 crew would be joyful to see how well the United States has gotten into space travel today and years to come.